The silence of Pelican Bay, California's most feared prison. The year was 1989, deep in the mist-covered forests of Crescent City, California. Construction crews completed a facility unlike anything the state had ever built before. It wasn't a rehabilitation center. It wasn't a typical maximum security prison. It was a fortress of silence. Pelican Bay State Prison, a place designed to bury the state's most violent and influential inmates far from the public eye, from the sky. Pelican Bay looked more like a military base than a correctional institution. Rows of gray concrete blocks, high steel fences, and 24-hour surveillance towers standing in eerie stillness. But what made this prison infamous wasn't what could be seen on the outside. It was what happened inside its security housing unit, known simply as the SHU. The SHU was not just solitary confinement. It was a world engineered to erase sound, connection, and identity. Each cell measured only 8 by 10 feet, with solid concrete walls and no windows to the outside world. A narrow slot allowed guards to slide in food trays without opening the door. Inmates spent 23 hours a day alone, with 1 hour permitted in a small, enclosed yard where they could glimpse only a sliver of sky. Over time, Pelican Bay became the ultimate weapon in California's war against prison gangs. The SHU housed leaders of groups like the Aryan Brotherhood, Nuestra Familia, the Mexican Mafia, and the Black Guerrilla Family, men responsible for organizing murders, drug trafficking, and extortion across the state. Officials believed isolating these leaders would cut off gang communications, but in reality, it only forced them to evolve. Inmates learned to communicate through what became known as dead drops, coded letters disguised as legal documents, messages written in invisible ink, and cryptic notes passed through corrupt staff. Some tapped on cell walls or spoke through air vents, crafting languages that only fellow gang members could decipher. Despite layers of concrete and steel, orders from the SHU still reached the streets of Los Angeles, San Diego, and beyond. Inside, time stood still. Prisoners counted the seconds by the rhythm of the guards' boots echoing through the corridor. The silence wasn't peaceful, it was crushing. Inmates described hearing their own heartbeats at night, their minds unraveling in the absence of human voices. Many began to hallucinate. Others mutilated themselves just to feel something. By the late 1990s, Pelican Bay's SHU had become a symbol of psychological warfare. It wasn't just a place to punish the body. It was designed to control the mind. Journalists and human rights advocates began asking whether isolation of this magnitude crossed into cruelty. Officials defended it, saying it was necessary to maintain order in a system plagued by gang violence. But for the men inside, it was a daily battle for sanity. Letters smuggled out of the SHU painted a picture of men slowly dissolving. Veterans of the streets now talking to shadows or memorizing cracks in the wall just to keep their minds occupied. And yet, in the midst of silence, something was stirring. Quietly, through coded notes and whispered words, a plan was forming. The men society had buried alive were preparing to make themselves heard, not with violence, but with resistance. Because in 2011, Pelican Bay would become the center of one of the largest prisoner-led protests in U.S. history, a hunger strike that would force America to confront what was happening behind those soundproof walls. The summer of 2011 began like every other inside Pelican Bay, silent, cold, and motionless. Inmates rose to the sound of steel doors unlocking and guards' boots echoing down concrete corridors. Meals slid through narrow food slots. The lights never changed. Time didn't pass, it stretched. But beneath that silence, something extraordinary was happening. For years, the men of Pelican Bay Security Housing Unit had been cut off from the world. No phone calls, no contact visits, no group activities. Yet, somehow, messages began to move from cell to cell. They traveled through air vents, drain pipes, and tiny notes hidden inside legal mail. A network of communication, patient, invisible, and relentless, began to form. These messages weren't about gang orders or revenge. They carried a new purpose, unity. Rival gang members, who had once ordered hits on each other, began working together against a common enemy, the system that kept them buried alive. The plan was simple but dangerous, a hunger strike. Thousands of inmates across California's prisons would refuse food, demanding an end to indefinite solitary confinement and better conditions inside the SHU. On July 1st, 2011, it began. Breakfast trays went untouched. Lunch sat cold in hallways. By sunset, word had spread across the entire prison system. From San Quentin to Folsom, inmates joined in. Within days, more than 6,000 prisoners across California were refusing to eat. For prison officials, it was chaos wrapped in silence. No riots, no noise, just defiance. The men who were never supposed to communicate had coordinated one of the largest peaceful protests in U.S. prison history, without ever seeing each other's faces. As the days dragged on, hunger became a weapon. Some inmates collapsed from exhaustion. Others were taken to the medical ward, refusing even 4 fluids. Guards who had once viewed the prisoners as monsters began to see something different. Desperation, not danger. The inmates' demands were clear. End indefinite solitary confinement. Allow group recreation for those who behaved. Stop labeling prisoners as gang members without proof. Give access to educational and rehabilitative programs. Outside the prison, family members and activists took notice. Protesters gathered outside the gates of Pelican Bay holding signs that read, "End the torture," and "We are all human." For the first time, America was forced to confront what was happening behind the concrete walls of its own correctional system. News outlets called the SHU a modern dungeon. Psychologists compared its effects to psychological torture. The state initially dismissed the strike. But when it grew, when letters began pouring in from universities, clergy members, and human rights groups, the pressure became impossible to ignore. After 3 weeks, prison officials met with inmate representatives and promised changes. The hunger strike ended, but the silence didn't. Just 2 years later, in 2013, it happened again, this time even bigger. Nearly 30,000 inmates across the state joined the strike. For 2 months, men in dozens of prisons refused meals. Some described hearing guards whisper, "They're really doing again." This was a rebellion. It was exposure. Behind the scenes, California's Department of Corrections faced lawsuits, national scrutiny, and growing outrage. The inmates' message was spreading, that years of solitary confinement weren't just punishment. They were breaking people apart. By 2015, after decades of silence, the walls of Pelican Bay began to crack. The state announced an agreement to end indefinite isolation for most prisoners and transfer hundreds out of the SHU. It was a victory. Quiet, fragile, but real. For the first time, sunlight reached men who hadn't seen it in decades. Some cried. Some stood motionless, blinking into the open air like they were waking from a long nightmare. But others feared it wasn't over. They whispered that Pelican Bay would never truly change, that silence had become part of its soul. Because in a place built on isolation, freedom can feel just as frightening as the walls that kept you in. The hunger strikes ended, but the echoes remained. In 2015, after years of pressure from activists, journalists, and former inmates, California reached a landmark settlement. The agreement promised to end indefinite solitary confinement in the state's prisons, a policy that had once defined Pelican Bay Security Housing Unit. For the first time in decades, hundreds of men walked out of their SHU cells, squinting into sunlight they hadn't seen in years. Some stepped onto the yard trembling, their skin pale, their movements hesitant, as if the open air itself was foreign. Others didn't speak at all. Years of silence had reshaped their minds, their voices rough with disuse. Prison officials described it as a new era, a shift from punishment to rehabilitation. The infamous SHU blocks that had once held California's most feared gang leaders were now partially empty, the sound of doors clanging replaced by an uneasy quiet. But for many, the psychological damage was already irreversible. Doctors and psychologists who visited Pelican Bay after reforms reported something haunting. Men who couldn't sleep in open dorms because the noise overwhelmed them. Men who stood motionless for hours because they no longer knew how to interact with others. Decades in the dark had rewired their brains. Some begged to return to solitary, calling it the only place they still felt safe. Outside the walls, the debate continued. To some, the reforms were a victory for human rights, proof that change was possible even in a system built on control. To others, they were a dangerous gamble, releasing gang leaders back into the general population where violence could once again erupt. Law enforcement officials warned that many of these men had never been truly rehabilitated, only contained. Still, for a time, hope hung in the air. Family members drove for hours to see loved ones they hadn't touched in decades. One mother, interviewed outside the prison gate, said, "I finally saw my son's face in the sunlight. He's older, but he's still alive." Yet beneath the surface, Pelican Bay never truly changed. The walls remained the same color, gray, sterile, unfeeling. The cameras still watched from every corner. Guards still walked the same sterile corridors where silence felt heavier than sound. Even with reforms, isolation continued under new names: restricted custody units, behavioral management programs, systems that separated high-risk inmates in ways that often mirrored the SHU itself. The hunger strikes had forced reform, but they hadn't erased the idea that control and confinement were the ultimate answers to chaos. By the early 2020s, reports surfaced again, men spending 22 hours a day in cells, inmates claiming the new policies were solitary by another name. Civil rights attorneys argued that the ghost of the SHU still haunted the institution. Pelican Bay's silence hadn't been broken. It had simply evolved. Outside the prison, the landscape remains eerily beautiful. Endless redwoods, thick fog, and the sound of the Pacific crashing in the distance. Locals say on quiet nights, you can almost hear the hum of the prison lights from miles away, a faint reminder of the fortress in the forest. To this day, Pelican Bay stands as a paradox, a place of control that once lost control, a system that tried to silence violence and ended up silencing humanity. Inside those walls, men who once commanded armies of criminals are now just voices in the dark, reminders of a system that can cage the body but never fully cage the mind. As one former inmate said years later, looking back at the gray cells where he'd spent 2 decades, you can survive Pelican Bay, but you don't ever leave behind. It stays in you. The silence follows you forever. And that's the truth behind California's most feared prison. Not the violence, not the gangs, but the quiet that never ends.